Welcome to the Evolution of Immunity module. In this talk, we're going to learn about the protective mechanisms that plants have evolved. We will first learn about the characteristics of the immune system in higher organisms, and then move on to learning about different mechanisms that plants use to defend themselves. The immune system in higher organisms is highly evolved, and this is due to the fact that many different types of organisms are able to cause diseases in higher organisms. Thus, the higher organisms have to have mechanism to provide protection against these different types of pathogens. The pathogens can be viruses, which we should note are non-living organisms, or they can be unicellular organisms like bacteria. Fungi are also known to infect higher organisms, and fungi can be unicellular or multicellular. Protists, which are eukaryotic organisms, can also infect higher organisms, and worms like helminths are also known to cause infections in higher organisms. Thus, the higher organisms have a variety of organisms that they have to defend themselves against. They are able to do so by producing many different types of antimicrobial compounds, as well as synthesizing different types of proteins that help in the recognition of pathogens. They have also evolved mechanisms to make variations of same type of proteins that enable in the recognition and elimination of different types of pathogens. The immune system of higher organisms also retains the memory of pathogens. Thus, the immune system of higher organisms is a product of millions of years of evolution. In order to understand how such a complex system has evolved in higher organisms, let us first look at the different defenses that lower organisms or simpler organisms like prokaryotes and protists have evolved. Prokaryotes are the earliest living forms that evolved on Earth, and they can be grouped in the kingdom of eubacteria and archaebacteria. Prokaryotes are unicellular, and they do not have membrane-bound organelles inside their cells. They compete with each other for space and nutrients, and so they have evolved different mechanisms to protect themselves from other organisms. These include the production of toxins to prevent the growth of other types of prokaryotes or even simpler eukaryotes. Additionally, prokaryotes can be infected by viruses, and thus they have mechanisms to protect themselves against viruses. This is usually done by preventing the absorption and entry of viruses, synthesizing enzymes like restriction endonuclease that can degrade viral DNA, disrupting the viral life cycle, and evolving the CRISPR-Cas system, which is a system that is able to not only protect against viruses, but maintain memory of viruses that have infected the organism previously. After prokaryotes, protists evolved, which are eukaryotes that evolved from archaea. These organisms belong to the kingdom of Protista, which is the most diverse kingdom of life. Protists have evolved different mechanisms of protection, which include producing toxic substances that can prevent the growth of other organisms like prokaryotes. This is an evolutionarily conserved mechanism, which we see in prokaryotes as well. Protists are eukaryotes, and hence they have membrane-bound organelles like lysosomes. Lysosomes have hydrolytic enzymes that can be used to degrade and eliminate any type of microorganism that is inside the protist. Protists also produce extrasomes, which are membrane-bound vesicles that have compounds in them that can be delivered to the environment by exocytosis and defend the protist in that manner. protists also have the mechanism of RNA interference, which is similar to the CRISPR-Cas system found in prokaryotes that enable to protect the protist against viruses. Some protists evolved into organisms that belong to the kingdom Plantae. All plants, which are members of the kingdom Plantae, have a cell wall and are autotrophs. There is a huge diversity among plants, and the first plants that evolved are the non-vascular plants that include the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. From these plants, we evolved the vascular plants, and the earlier vascular plants are the ferns or the pterophytes. After the pterophytes, the gymnosperms evolved, and these are also vascular plants that can grow into massive sizes. In fact, the world's largest organism is the sequoia tree, which is a gymnosperm. After gymnosperms, the angiosperms or flowering plants evolved. As the plants became more and more complex, they had to evolve different mechanisms to protect themselves from infections. Plants can be infected and attacked by a wide variety of organisms, and hence they have evolved different protective strategies to defend themselves. One such strategy is the evolutionarily conserved strategy of producing molecules that are toxic to pathogens. These can include antifungal, antiviral, or antibacterial molecules. One such molecule is shown in this figure, which is a defensin. A defensin is an antimicrobial peptide, and the way it functions is that it is able to disrupt the plasma membrane by making holes or pores in it. Because of that, there is stress on the cell wall, and the cell wall is unable to protect the pathogen the way it normally does. This can lead to the death of the pathogen. As plants and pathogens evolved with time, different protective strategies also had to come into play. And one such protective strategy is the production of intracellular proteins called resistance proteins or R proteins. Now, in some cases, some pathogens evolved to produce molecules called effectors, and these molecules would be able to inhibit the signaling pathway that is a result of pattern-triggered immunity. By inhibiting these signaling pathways, the defense genes would no longer be expressed in the plant cells. Thus, the plants had to evolve, and as a part of coevolution, they were able to start synthesizing proteins called R proteins. These R proteins are able to bind to the effector molecules made by the pathogens, and by binding to them, they are able to activate a signaling pathway which restores the expression of the defense genes. Thus, this type of immunity is called as effector-triggered immunity, and it evolved after pattern-triggered immunity. As plants became larger in size and more complex in nature, there was a need to evolve strategies that allowed the plant to protect different parts of it from pathogens. One such strategy is the systemic acquired resistance strategy. Upon activation of pattern-targeted immunity and/or effector-targeted immunity, the infected cells are able to produce molecules that are made in that infected cell, which is shown in the figure in the blue box. And these molecules that are shown in those pink structures are able to be transported from one cell to the other cells of the plant. And so this way, when we look at a plant, in one part, if there is an infection, these higher complex plants have evolved a strategy where they're making molecules that can move through the plant cells and go to different parts of the plant. Thus, these molecules are able to protect the plant in locations that are away from the original site of infection. And thus, if a pathogen goes to another part of the plant, then the plant already has defenses ready to combat that pathogen. These molecules serve as a memory of the infection, and they're able to mediate their effects by activating defense genes in plants. This strategy is called as the systemic acquired resistance strategy. Another strategy that plants use to defend themselves is RNA interference, which is an evolutionarily conserved strategy of defense. In this strategy, double-stranded RNA that is introduced into the plants that is foreign in nature is recognized by the plant cells and is digested and cleaved to form small interfering RNA that ultimately associate with the RISC complex and can bind to other mRNA complexes that are reintroduced in the plant at a later point in time and cleave those RNA structures. With this, we come to the end of our talk, where we learned about the different characteristics of the immune system in higher organisms and how plants have evolved different strategies to defend themselves from pathogens.